What's up, y'all? It's GC Kinsey, here to talk about the signs of my asexuality that I showed throughout my life but missed, and why I only recognized them in hindsight. A little while back, I made a video about the signs of my transmasculinity that I missed, and I asked if anyone was interested in a similar video about the signs of my asexuality. Several of y'all said yes, so here it is. Just to set some context first, I started questioning my orientation at age 24 and came out as ace at age 26. So not old by any means, but still older than a lot of my queer friends were when they figured things out. So I do consider myself as someone who came out later in life. I also didn't think I showed any obvious signs of my asexuality before I came out, especially during my younger years, until I went back and looked at my past through that lens, and then I went, oh, I was so very clearly ace. I probably should have figured it out sooner, but there were some very real reasons why I didn't, which I'll be getting into. But before I do, I want to give a quick warning that there will be mentions of sex throughout this video. Nothing explicit or graphic, and it's all framed from a sex education perspective, but it's still kind of necessary to explain everything. And there will also be mentions of conservative Christianity and purity culture. So if any of that means this video is not for you, I totally understand, and I have a whole bunch of other ones you can check out instead. And now, without further ado, here are all the signs I missed that I was asexual. Number 1. A lot of sexual innuendo went over my head. My first clear memory of this was when Titanic came out, and even though I was way too young, I had just turned 10, I saw it in theaters, all my friends and classmates saw it. It was one of those movies that was too much of a cultural phenomenon for our parents not to take us, but anyway. I got to school and everyone was talking about how much they loved the movie, but they were so disappointed that their parents covered their eyes during that one scene where Rose and Jack have sex in the car. And I was just like, wait, that scene where they do what in the car? Because my parents didn't cover my eyes during that scene. I saw the whole thing, and I had no idea it was supposed to be a sex scene. I straight up thought they were just making out. You don't actually see them do the deed, you know? You see them kissing beforehand, and then you see Rose's sweaty handprint on the car window, and then you see them kissing afterward, and I literally thought that was all they did. Plus, I thought, why would people have sex when they just met a few days ago? And maybe you could chalk this up to the fact that I was too young to get it, but all my classmates were the same age as me and they got it, so... This kind of thing continued throughout the rest of my youth and into early adulthood. I never assumed that anyone had sex unless it was explicitly spelled out to me. I missed a lot of sexual innuendo and song lyrics in particular, and one of my favorite genres of music, rock and roll, is full of innuendo, especially in older songs. You listen to rock music from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, a lot of it is absolutely filthy, in clever ways designed to skirt the censors that also completely escaped my asexual ass. I got better at catching it over time as I developed a very dirty sense of humor and more or less trained myself to look out for it. But sometimes, if I'm not paying enough attention, it still goes right over my head, even now that I'm in my 30s. Case in point, I used to think Cake by the Ocean was a song about literal cake, which might be the most ace interpretation ever. It didn't occur to me that this could be a sign of asexuality because, one, if I wasn't catching the innuendo itself, then how could I have caught this as a sign? And two, if anything, I attributed it to growing up in a purity culture environment where everyone was pretty prudish about sex. So it didn't hit me that my asexuality had anything to do with this until long after I came out. Number 2. I used to wonder whether I might be bi. I've actually heard a surprising number of other aces say this. They thought they were bi or pan at first before they realized they were ace. And this phenomenon stems from being sexually attracted to all genders equally, but then realizing that your level of sexual attraction is none. In my case, I remember being in my early teen years and having these fleeting thoughts of, wait, am I bi? Which sadly I immediately repressed and didn't let myself dwell on too much. But it happened because I found myself noticing noticing girls and women's good looks and admiring their beauty just as much as I did with boys and men. And I am using intentionally binary language here because at that time, I didn't know that non-binary people existed, much less that I was one of them, so I sadly thought that men and women were the only two options. I also didn't know about the split attraction model yet, so I had no way of putting my admiration of people's good looks into context as aesthetic attraction. And I hadn't yet realized that I didn't have any sexual attraction to anybody because I didn't know how to separate sexual attraction from aesthetic or sensual or romantic or alterous attraction, so I was just really confused. I ultimately concluded that I must not be bi because while I found women beautiful, I never had a crush on one or wanted to date one the way I did with men. There was just no romantic attraction there. Though of course the joke's on me because as it turns out, I actually am demi/bi romantic. It's just that the genders I'm romantically attracted to don't include women, they include men and masculine leaning NBs. But I've still never been sexually attracted to anyone of any gender ever. And I think it's super easy to miss that when you don't know what asexuality is or what the split attraction model is or very much about queer orientations in general. So I attribute missing this sign to the overwhelming lack of sex education in schools, particularly around sexual orientation. Number 3. I had weird feelings I couldn't explain around the concept of virginity. For this one, I need to set some context first about the kind of environment I grew up in and how I was taught about sex. So, I grew up in a small rural town in the Bible Belt part of the southern US where most of the people there were conservative Christians, and the dominant cultural attitudes on sex reflected those conservative Christian values. One of those values is the idea that you're supposed to save your virginity for marriage, aka stay pure for your spouse, hence the name purity culture for this kind of environment. One of the greatest harms that this kind of environment perpetuates is abstinence-only sex education. My school did kind of a strange thing where we didn't have abstinence-only sex ed, but all they taught us was what happens during puberty and what kinds of STIs you might get if you have sex, which came with all kinds of warnings about wearing condoms. They didn't teach us about the mechanics of sex or about pregnancy. I guess they figured we would just pick that up somewhere else. And unlike most of the rest of my peers, I learned about those things when I was in kindergarten because I asked and my parents answered. At that point, I'd been around enough pregnant folks to know that that's where babies came from, but I was curious about how the babies got in there in the first place. And while my parents gave me an age-appropriate explanation, they didn't lie, they still said, tab A goes into slot B. Now, we weren't a super religious family. I was never religious and still am not, and my parents had grown up Christian but weren't regular churchgoers or anything, and they didn't have those same strongly conservative Christian values that most of the other people in my hometown did. So maybe that's why they went ahead and told me how sex worked. But the one thing they did share with the rest of our purity culture environment was the belief that you were supposed to save your virginity for marriage. So with all of that context in mind, here's where my personal beliefs about virginity were similar and different from purity culture. I didn't believe that everyone should save it for marriage. First of all, I didn't even believe that marriage was right for everyone. But more importantly, I didn't believe that there was one set right or wrong way for every single person to lose their virginity. However, I did very strongly believe in saving my own virginity, not necessarily for marriage, but for the right person. And for only one person. I absolutely did not want to have more than one sexual partner. So I always thought, whenever I do lose my virginity, it will be with the one person I'm going to spend the rest of my life with, whether we're married or not. And I thought it was important for my future life partner to have the same kind of values around virginity that I did, even though I struggled to articulate exactly why. I didn't believe in judging anyone for having sex for any reason, so in that sense it shouldn't really matter, right? But I worried that if my partner didn't place the same kind of value on their virginity that I did on mine, that we would always have some kind of weird power imbalance around sex. What I didn't account for in any of my beliefs was what happens if you never find the right person, or if you find the right person romantically but not sexually. And by the way, that's why I now absolutely hate the response of, well, you just haven't found the right person yet whenever I come out as ace, which is all too common for aces to hear. Once I realized I was ace, that threw everything I'd always believed about virginity for a loop. Because even though I didn't have remotely conservative Christian reasons for saving my virginity, I was still using the influence of the purity culture environment I'd grown up in as an excuse to hold on to it. When the real reason I was holding on to it was just that I didn't want to have sex. Ever. That became crystal clear once I figured out I was ace, but before that, I never saw my weird feelings about virginity as a potential sign of asexuality. And I chalk that up to the fact that someone who's ace but doesn't know it yet, and who grew up in a purity culture environment, would naturally have some pretty complicated feelings about virginity and all the cultural baggage that goes with it. Number 4. I never had to resist the urge to have sex. This one goes hand in hand with the last one, and it's tangled up with a specific aspect of conservative Christian purity culture, which is that you will inevitably get all kinds of advice about how to resist the urge to have sex. And I always found that advice confusing because I didn't have this urge people spoke of. Whenever I had a crush, the most I could picture doing with that person physically was kissing. Sex just wasn't something I wanted. This might seem like a super obvious sign of asexuality, and that's probably true if you know what asexuality is. But I didn't find out that asexuality existed until I was 20 years old. And even then, I couldn't really relate to it because I learned about asexuality through a documentary where it was very heavily conflated with aromanticism, and everyone they interviewed was aro-ace. I may be on the aromantic spectrum, I'm demi-romantic ace, but the fact that I'm gray aro means that I felt just enough romantic attraction that I can't really relate to aro-ace experiences. And I was in my mid-20s before I found out that not all aces are aro. But during my preteen and teen years when I was getting most of this advice about resisting the urge, I didn't even know that you could be ace. So the fact that I didn't have the urge to have sex never made me question my orientation. I just thought I was very good at fulfilling the expectations that purity culture demanded of everyone. And when you consider the complicated feelings I had around virginity, that makes even more sense why I would miss this sign. My logic was, if what you're supposed to do is save your virginity for marriage, and if what I want to do is save mine for the right person, married or not, then my lack of any urge to have sex just makes that all the more convenient. So yeah, I blame purity culture and lack of sex ed, again, for why I missed this sign. But, you might ask, didn't I think it was unusual that everyone else had to resist the urge to have sex and I didn't? Well, actually no, and that leads me to the next sign I missed. Number 5. I thought everyone else was faking their sexual attraction. Growing up, whenever I heard any of my peers talking about how much they wanted to have sex or how hard it was to resist the urge, on the outside I pretended to understand, but on the inside I was like, sounds fake, but okay. In high school, not very many of my classmates were having sex, or if they were, they weren't talking about it. There were only a small handful who were, and one of them was even talking about it in the context of regretting it and wishing she could get her virginity back, so I just assumed that the very few people who were bragging about their sexual sexploits, or talking about their struggles to resist the urge weren't doing that because they actually wanted sex. After all, I didn't want it, so I found it hard to imagine why anyone else would. Instead, I thought they were having sex or wanting to have sex to make their partners happy, or rebel against their parents, or score popularity points, or pretty much any other reason. And I never doubted this theory until I went to college. My university was in an area that was much more heavily populated and progressive than the town I'd grown up in, so I was finally in an area where purity culture wasn't the dominant social norm. And right away, I noticed that lots of people were very sexually active. I went from being in the majority of people who weren't having sex to the extreme minority of people who weren't. And that did give me pause about my assumption that everyone was faking their sexual attraction or their enjoyment of sex. But I ultimately concluded that it was still fake and that the reason so many people were having so much sex was because of the way dating culture worked on my college campus. From what I observed, serious committed relationships were out, and casual relationships, situationships, friends with benefits, and one-night stands were in. And if you were going to play that game, then you were going to have sex to fit in. So I figured that people were faking their sexual attraction so that they could participate in this dating culture and not have to be alone. Thinking that sexual attraction sounds fake seems like a glaring sign of asexuality, so why did I miss this one? Well, when you think that everyone else is faking their sexual attraction, then you assume that they actually feel the same lack of attraction that you do, and then you don't have any reason to believe you're different. What's super interesting is that when I learned what asexuality was, my reaction wasn't, "That sounds fake, but okay." I was just like, "Oh, that's a thing?" Which probably should have clued me in a lot sooner, but oh well, better late than never. Which brings me to my final sign. Number 6. I was a late bloomer indefinitely. All throughout my younger years, I always assumed that once I grew up and found whoever my right person was, that I would somehow magically want to have sex with them. Never mind the fact that I'd never wanted to have sex with anyone before. Never mind the fact that I thought everyone else around me was faking, or at the very least grossly exaggerating how much they wanted to have sex. I figured it would happen for me someday. It wasn't until I was 24 years old and going through a breakup with my partner of 2 years over sexual incompatibility, aka he wanted to have sex and I didn't, that I finally realized the late bloomer excuse didn't hold water anymore. I had found who I thought was my right person and it didn't change anything. It didn't make me magically want sex after all. This was the sign that finally got me to question my orientation and realize that I was ace. But how did I miss it until my mid-20s? I'm not entirely sure, but I suspect it's because I was single all throughout college, and there was nothing during those years to indicate to me how unusual my late bloomer status was. And who knows, if I hadn't had that relationship in my 20s, then I might have gone on thinking I was a late bloomer well into my 30s. The idea that I would finally bloom, aka experience sexual attraction, for the right person meant that as long as I was single, this particular sign of my asexuality was super easy to miss. But I'm glad that I finally did end up catching it and that it ultimately led me down the path to discovering who I truly am. So, those are all the signs I missed, and now is where I want to wrap things up and turn the conversation over to you. If you're somewhere on the ace spectrum, are there any signs of your asexuality that you missed? How much do you think the overall lack of education and visibility around asexuality in society might have contributed to you missing those signs? What was it that finally got you to explore your orientation and figure things out? And whether you're ace or not, what questions do you have about all this? Drop a comment below and let's get a discussion going. You can also reach out to me on other social media. I'm GC Kinsey across all platforms. And while you're here, feel free to check out some of my other videos. I've got more vlogs like this one about my experiences as a queer person, along with cosplay music videos, cosplay tutorials, a whole bunch of cool resources for singers about voice changes on testosterone, and more right here on this channel. So make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss anything new. And with that, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for all of your support. I hope this gave you some new things to think about, and I will see you on the next one.